Hi, it's biological anthropologist Jonathan Marks again, here to talk about the scientific revolution from the standpoint of human origins and diversity. The great message of physics and astronomy in the age of Galileo was the very threatening message that there's a lot that the Bible has left out, like the earth is in the sky as a floating ball circling the sun. That is extremely unbiblical. From the standpoint of the study of human origins and diversity, however, the structure of the solar system is of minor consequence. But there were other things going on in the 1600s of more direct relevance. Now, if we recall the story of Noah's Ark, in which the animals are led into the big boat 2 by 2, and thus survive the gigantic flood, the Bible says they did, well, that raises a question about the present day. It turns out that there was this large, flightless, and tasty bird that lived only on one island, the island of Mauritius, which was colonized by the Dutch. And near the end of the 1600s, this large, flightless, and tasty bird was no longer there. The bird was called the dodo. And the question was it really extinct? And there was a reasonable argument that it could not be extinct because Noah was charged with preventing extinction. The Bible says he succeeded, and it would make no sense for God to decide afterwards that, okay, animals can now go extinct. Our God, after all, is a rational engineer, not a mad king. But by the end of the century, it was pretty clear that no more dodos were going to be found, hiding somewhere in a cave in Antarctica or anywhere else. Moreover, not only was extinction a feature of the present, it was becoming clear that it had been a feature of the past as well. And in 1693, John Ray, a contemporary of Isaac Newton, notes that many species of shellfish are lost out of the world, which philosophers hitherto have been unwilling to admit, esteeming the destruction of any one species a dismembering of the universe and rendering it imperfect, whereas they think the divine providence is especially concerned to secure and preserve the works of creation. Well, they're obviously wrong, aren't they? There are no more dodos. They seem to have gone the way of the trilobites and ammonites, which are kind of like some familiar living animals, but different. The trilobites must have made it onto the ark like everything else, but they died off, just as the dodo did, which makes the Noah story that much weirder. God saves all the animals. He miraculously brings the anacondas and kangaroos, possums and Himalayan snow leopards and llamas and gets them all to Noah so they can be saved from the flood. Then sends them back where they came from, and after all that, he lets them go extinct anyway? Theologically, that seems almost childlike. Yet clearly extinction is real. The question is, what does it mean? Another thing we need to acknowledge is that our similarity to the monkeys and apes was never a secret. The people of Borneo called orangutans the man of the woods. An ancient Roman poet named Quintus Ennius, whose work is now lost, wrote, "How similar to us is the monkey, the most horrid beast." That saying was preserved by Cicero, whose works were memorized by centuries of Latin students, and was repeated in the foundational scientific works of Francis Bacon and Carl Linnaeus. No secret here that we are like monkeys. And of course, anyone who had ever eaten a chicken recognized the fundamental similarity between their own body and their dinner. In fact, some of the best evidence for cannibalism tens of thousands of years ago is butchery marks on human bones that are in the corresponding places as butchery marks on animal bones. So the correspondence of form between the human body and that of other species is not news. It just requires a creative explanation. By the mid-1600s, European sailors were returning with tales about creatures that were kind of like people, but lived either in West Africa or Borneo, and maybe were hairy, and maybe they walked erect, and maybe they communicated in whistles, but unfortunately they were unable to bring one home, because, as we now know, apes do not survive very well on a diet of biscuits and salt pork, which is what the sailors were eating. So after a few days it would die and they would throw its carcass overboard and tell stories about the chimpanzee that they almost brought home. Finally, in 1698, one of these creatures finally makes it to England, where it dies in about a month and is dissected by the leading physician in England, Edward Tyson. And this is what Tyson examined. Now, there are a number of interesting features about this animal, which is obviously a chimpanzee, even though he calls it a pygmy and an orangutan. For example, Tyson counts up the similarities between the body of this creature and a monkey and finds 34 such similarities. But when he compares the chimpanzee to a human, he finds 48 similarities. So this creature is more like a human than the most human-like creature out there. In fact, Tyson was so impressed by the physical similarity of this creature to humans, in which every bone, every muscle, every organ matched the human condition almost perfectly, so he couldn't figure out why it walked around using its knuckles, when it's clearly built for bipedalism like us. And he concludes that it must have been walking that way because it was sick, which it was. But he didn't see it walking bipedally, even though he thought it was built for it. And he thought that knuckle walking was an abnormal behavior. So he has it drawn standing up with the aid of a cane. And that cane is going to stay with pictures of the apes for over the next century. Not only that, but the Bible certainly implies that we are all descended in some way from Noah and ultimately from Adam. So we're all presumably brothers and sisters under the skin. But we already know there's a lot the Bible has left out, like the heliocentric solar system. So maybe, argues Isaac de la Peyrere in 1655, the Bible also leaves out all the other creations. Maybe it's only telling us about the ancestry of the peoples of the Near East, the last and presumably best of the different creations by God of different kinds of people. Consequently, there might have been men before Adam. That is to say, the product of earlier creations in other parts of the world. This was by no means a scientific document. It's a discourse upon some verses in Paul's epistle to the Romans, but it holds a place for being the first work in early modern times to publicly question the literal understanding of Adam and Eve. He also plants some other seeds, because when the issue of slavery is on the table, the question of whether we Europeans are enslaving our own kind or a different kind has some moral value. If Africans were created separately from Europeans, for example, then kidnapping and enslaving them might only be different in magnitude from domesticating the horse or the dog. So it actually becomes a popular pro-slavery scientific position in the early 1800s. But this is 1655, and there are just public burnings of his book in Paris. But he will set up an interesting historical paradox. Peyrere's theory of multiple human origins, or polygenesis, will gain American followers 2 centuries later, just before the Civil War. And they will say, hey, the Bible is just a book of myths. We're not all brothers and sisters under the skin. We are the products of separate creative acts by God, and we share no common ancestry at all. People are as they always have been. Now that, of course, is the core belief of creationism, but the ideologies don't quite line up according to modern sensibilities. Because on the other hand, we have traditional biblical monogenism, with God creating Adam and Eve as the parents of the entire species. And here the Bible is harmonious with the moral argument for abolition, for we're all brothers and sisters under the skin, the children of Adam and Eve. But there was an interesting scientific problem here too. Namely, if you accepted the biblical position and the moral position of abolitionism, then you somehow had to account for how Adam and Eve eventually produced the diversity of human form we see today. In other words, if Adam and Eve, for the sake of argument, were black, then where did white people come from? You have to generate a theory to explain the production of physical difference through time. And these biblical literalists will develop the first theories of evolution, microevolution to be sure, but the first naturalistic theories of physical change in biological form through time, in order to reconcile the fact of human diversity to the biblical narrative. The creationists are the ones liberally interpreting the Bible, and the ones taking the Bible literally are the ones thinking about evolution. As soon as The Origin of Species comes out in 1859 and says nothing explicitly about humans, Darwin's American friends immediately present it in the context of a secularized monogenism. But we get ahead of ourselves. The last thing from the 1600s is the idea of race itself, particularly the continental races, Europeans, Africans, Asians, Americans. The idea that the continents contain largely homogeneous peoples distinct from other continents was a very novel position, since diversity was always understood to be local. The people here are like this, the people there are like that. As far as ancestry goes, there was a biblical tradition that held us all to be descended from Noah and his 3 sons, Ham, the father of Africans, Shem, the father of Asians, and Japheth, the father of Europeans. Of course, they couldn't have been so different since they were brothers. But more importantly, that biblical metaphor became obsolete at the end of the 1400s, when it was clear that there was a 4th continent. But Noah still only had 3 sons. And so mapmakers came up with a new metaphor for the now 4 continents: scantily clad women. Mapmakers began to allegorize the 4 continents in the 4 corners of their maps. By the early 1600s, this was a standard artistic practice, and this book, Cesare Ripa's Iconology, is all about how to draw allegorically. And he shows us Europe wearing a crown, holding a church, with a horn of plenty and riding a horse. More commonly, Europe will be associated with a bull, which is the form that Zeus took when he raped Europa. Asia is associated with a camel and incense representing the Eastern Church. She wears a garland wreath. Africa has a lion and a scorpion and wears the head of an elephant as a hat. And America has a bow and arrow and a feather headdress and is accompanied by an alligator. Notice these are not racialized images. They symbolize the land masses, not the people on the land masses. From 1652, here is Europe with a crown and some bulls in the background, Asia with incense and a camel, America with a bow and arrow astride an armadillo, and Africa on a crocodile with some lions in the background. Again, these are not racialized images. They are symbolizing continents. But the women start to pull double symbolic duty. I like this one because it's late, 1720s, and obviously influenced by the political economics of the age. Once again, Europe with a crown and a horse surveying the globe. Asia got her incense. Africa looking just a bit different from everybody else, and she's got her elephant hat back. And America with a feather headdress and bow and arrow. These women are beginning to symbolize not just the continents, but the people on the continents. It's the height of the slave trade, and Africa is dark, representing its people. But here's the kicker. That wasn't science. That was art. It won't become science until slightly later, when Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, takes on the human species in the first edition of his book System of Nature, and color-coding the human subspecies or varieties as whitish, reddish, brownish, and blackish. So the idea of continental races is an invention of 17th century artists that diffused into science and came to dominate science for a couple of centuries. Chew on that.